Okay, so welcome to the webinar on special populations. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of scope of what we're going to cover tonight. So obviously, when we think about special populations for kind of our level 2 and then beyond, we're talking about three really groups of people here. So we're speaking about youths, probably 14 to 16-year-olds if you are going to work with youths. We're talking about older people who maybe be 50 plus, but when we think about 50 plus, really nowadays we're thinking about people who might have ailments and might have to have their programs adjusted or whatever. And then the other thing they started doing is now saying it's only prenatal that they're dealing with, but I'll dive a little bit into the postnatal as well later down the line. So those are the three types of groups we're going to cover this evening. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split it into two sections. First section, we're going to talk about the workbook and what we should be doing for the workbook. And then in the second section, I'll talk a little bit about real life and how we would actually work with these groups, because it's two very different things that you're getting told here. And really, when you're in the gym, it's a totally different thing. So let's kick off with the workbook. Now, the manual in my eyes doesn't give you a great scope of special populations at all. It doesn't really deal with them well. It doesn't really give you too much information. And that's why when you get to the program cards in level 2, people start to struggle a little bit with how to then put that down. So I came up with a 3-point kind of thing to make it easy for people. We think about what adaptation, what precaution we might do for that special population, why we're doing it, and then the justification of it all. So it's nice, easy 3 points that really gets the thing across. So I'll highlight why we do it that way now, rather than just leaving that to later on. So we do it that way because when we're thinking about special populations, it can be as easy as just shifting the weight for somebody who's a bit older and they're maybe struggling with the weight because they've lost a little bit of muscle. But what they're looking for in the workbook is for you to display some kind of understanding. So to do that, we have to come up with, well, what could go wrong for that special population? So i.e., why are we doing the precaution or the adaptation, or even telling them to use an alternative in the first place? Why are we then asking them to do that? It'll have a justification. So that's when we can write our own justification why we feel they need to do that. And then we try to bring it back round to the actual first instance of the exercise. So say it was a cardiovascular machine, you've got somebody running on a treadmill, you have to adapt that for a youth. Well, we know that running outdoors will be good for a youth, so that's going to be much better, but still work the same muscles. And that's how we then 360 it back round. We're still working those same muscles, and there'll be other benefits, which I'll cover in a little bit as well. So when we're dealing with special populations, you've got that in your tool bag to first of all help you describe that in the workbook, but also we have to understand what we can and cannot put in the workbook. So what will be able to get you a pass and what won't. Specifically, when we're looking at youths, we're looking at things like they can't use any of the cardiovascular equipment. And the reason for that is because they're designed for adults. It's the very same thing when we come to resistance machines. All resistance machines were designed with adults in mind. They weren't designed with children or youths. Also, when we think about it, they really shouldn't be using that kind of load. Even a light load might be too much for some youths. So again, that's where resistance machines wouldn't be great. Youths also shouldn't be really loaded too much. So again, we shouldn't be getting them to do any heavy weight bearing exercises. But bands, the dowel pole, a broomstick, TRX, these are the kind of things we can get them to use and get them to use quite easily. So that's where youths kind of sit there. Then they don't allude to this in the manual. So it is kind of hard to grasp that without you having to go away and actually do a lot of research. And even then, it's all conflicting stuff you get. Then we look at older generations, and this is where we can start to play about with medical conditions. So we know that osteoporosis might start to happen with older people. And you've got two chains of thoughts. You can either try to protect the bone that they have, or you can try to challenge the bone to try get the osteoblast to start working better. So these are things to consider with the kind of osteoporosis when you're making a decision on if that's what you're going to pick as the kind of thing you're overcoming. And that pops up maybe, again, maybe the treadmill. Do we have them running on a treadmill and it might hinder their process, or would we maybe weight bear them and that might be better for them? So not using a treadmill anymore, using a leg press, still working the same muscles, but they're not working their cardiovascular system anymore. So again, you'll have to weigh up, is the benefits outweighing the pros and the cons and all that. Also, there's loads of other things, loads of medical conditions that can pop up: lupus, COPD, cancer as well. You know, these things tend to happen in older populations. So we can bring up any number of things here. I would stick to basic ones just so you don't get yourself too tied up. Like the muscles are going to degenerate. You know, there could be atrophy there. You could get obviously osteoporosis. You could have heart conditions. You could have blood pressure issues. You could have diabetes. So there's a whole number of things in there that you could use with a older population and then overcome them. And then when we look at prenatal, we're looking at somebody, in my eyes, who is heavily pregnant. So we're looking into the third trimester of the 3, and that's because that's where most of the issues can occur. That's where we can get too much relaxing in the body, and the pelvis doesn't work as well, and the pelvic floor muscles aren't working as well. You can't load the body as much. The circulation and blood pressure can fluctuate. And there's so many problems that can happen in the third trimester. It's not to say they will, it's just for you doing this workbook, we need to think, right, what's happening here? How can we overcome it? So that gives you a kind of idea of what kind of conditions can come up. The next part is looking at the different points in the workbook and those program cards that you're going to have to cover. So we've mentioned CV already, and basically what you're looking to do is to give the person reading it, the IQA, an idea of your knowledge based on a cardiovascular device. So if you have a youth and you can't use a cardiovascular device, we are going to say to them, maybe go outside. So it doesn't matter if it's a stepper or a treadmill or whatever you've selected as your main CV. Your justification is getting them outdoors. It helps with the thermal regulation system because that's still developing in youths. No matter how they look, they might look like adults, but it's still developing. The muscular skeleton is still actually developing as well. So that impact you get extra from being outdoors is brilliant for a kid. So again, it's a really positive justification for asking them to go outdoors and do the activity. And it's obviously going to be working the cardiovascular system in the same kind of manner. So these are all the benefits, and that's what you would put in as your answer. They're not going to use the treadmill because it's designed for an adult. It does have all these good points to them, and then it's going to work the same cardiovascular system. When we look at an older person, we wouldn't have to take them out of the gym. Our solution could be as simple as taking them away from a treadmill because of osteoporosis and getting them to work on a bike, because they're still working the cardiovascular system, they're still working the legs muscles, but they're no longer having impact and they're supported. So that in itself should help with the osteoporosis. So again, that's a better answer than just reduce the speed. You know, reducing the speed, there's still going to be impact there. And then we look at prenatal, and again, I'm bringing up the treadmill because most people use the treadmill as their main CV when they're doing the programming. Um, if a pregnant woman is on a treadmill, it might be too much for the balance, because you can have balance issues that occur due to hormonal changes during the third trimester. So we would talk about maybe putting them on a recumbent bike, something that's got actual back support as well, and allows them to still continue to use the same muscles. But obviously, as well, you're going to get that aspect of being supported, but you're still using those heart and lung systems. So that kind of covers off the CV section. You then have the resistance one straight after this. And resistance, most of the time, it can be any kind of resistance machine. So I'm going to pull one out the hat and just say that we're doing chest press here. And again, you're going to pick one from your program for writing out these cards. So it's good to think about what kind of issues you might have occurring with different machines anyway. But this will give you a good indication of what you can put. So obviously a chest press machine for a youth, it's not designed for them again. So that's going to be your reason for changing, for adapting. We're going to get them to maybe do push-ups. Again, reason being, they can't use the machine. We're allowing them to use the same muscles, but we're also protecting that muscle skeleton system as it develops. So that it's not weight bearing and they're only using their body weight now. And that would be enough to pass that question. When we look at an older person, what might be the issue with our pec deck would be it might be uncomfortable to sit in. So again, we might use a cable machine where we can lower the weight a little bit, give them a bit more freedom of movement, because they might have flexibility issues. Again, very common with people who've maybe worked in offices most of their life. So again, really think about what the issue is we're overcoming. In this case, it's the flexibility issue. We're then getting them to stand up, use our cable pulley, do the same movement. We're solving the issue. We're using the same muscles. Again, problem solved. And then we look at a female who is pregnant. Again, the machine might not be great for sitting a pregnant lady into. It might be hard for them to get into the machine. So I would probably advocate at this point maybe doing a wall push-up where they are fully in control. And the only reason I do that instead of advising the cable pulley again is just to give you another option. So we're not copying answers, because it's good to have different solutions. Even though the same solution would have worked there, the cable pulley would be fine. But a wall push-up where they're standing, they have full control, and they'll be able to still do that exercise while still working the same muscles. The next one after that is going to be your free weight exercise. Yep. So you're talking about like deadlifts, squats, bench press, whatever you've selected for your actual exercise. We'll talk about squats here, just because it's the one I picked out the top of my head. For a youth, we wouldn't load them up with a barbell. We wouldn't load them up with that kind of weight. So we would maybe use a dowel pole at this point to teach them technique, because the weight would injure their muscle skeletal system, and that's still developing again. So that's the kind of thing that we're picking up on for this. And then we're still allowing them to do a squat, and we're still teaching them the correct movements and stuff with a little load, not too much load. For an older adult, it could be that they can't get out of a squat because of various issues. The free weight side of it might not be good for them. So again, we would have to pick what isn't good. Maybe they have muscle atrophy because they've been losing muscle because they haven't been active. They can't do barbell squats because of this. So we might take it all the way back and get them to just use a leg press machine. Stability there. They're not going to harm themselves. We can lower the weights and utilize all the same muscle groups again. And then for a pre-postnatal woman, our solution here might be just going to body weight, because the weight is throwing their center of balance off, or the baby weight is because they have the bump, that's throwing their centre of balance off. And again, we would then advise maybe not to use that. Just go to the body weight squat. We're still doing the movement. They still have the full flexibility, but there's no weight bearing there. And that way they can still complete it and still use the same muscles. We then have the last program card, the fourth one, which is body weight movements. So again, picking a common one here just because I see it a lot. Most people pick things like push-ups. So if we think about a youth, push-ups would probably be fine, but you will come across some youths that struggle with this. So that's going to be our point of contention here. A youth that can't control their own body yet, we're going to get them to do it on their knees. It's another regression back the way to allow them to still do the exercise, but a little bit regressed, still work those same muscles, and then we can build them up from there. Again, the reasoning behind that would be because they aren't in control of their body yet. The muscle skeletal system is still growing and still adapting to this, to the person. For an older person, I'm going to pick things like arthritis here. And the reason for that is because a person with arthritis is going to have problems getting down onto the floor. They might have issues other than that. And in this case, I might suggest that they do the chest press machine. That way they can sit on it, they're stable, they don't have to get down as low, and it's nice and comfortable for them. So they're still using the same muscles, but I've given an adaptation there. And then the prenatal one, again, it's not advised for you to get a woman on the floor supinated like that, or pronated like that, sorry. And I would just get them to do the standing push-up again. Or if you've already used that in one of your other answers, you could maybe think along the lines of using the cable pulley, because the baby bump makes it uncomfortable for them to go down and do push-ups on the floor, or blood pressure issues from getting up and down. Again, you'll have to problem solve what you want to be the problem and then fix it. But again, this is just an example of what you could do. So that's the kind of workbook side of it. And as you can see, when it's broken down like that, it is very basic. It is pretty easy to understand. But again, we don't have too much of that in the manual. So that's why it's good to have this kind of webinar to go over these kind of points. Now we're moving into the real life kind of situations that we might find ourselves in. So I've actually worked with all three of these special populations and more, because special populations is really a term for any kind of group that you might have to adapt training for. So there's disabilities out there that you'll have to adapt for, even some kinds of how you speak to people might have to be adapted for special populations. Like if you have somebody who's on the autistic spectrum, and you'll have to adapt and be able to coach differently. But I'm going to stick with the three that we have this evening. So my prior experience with youths has been when I worked in Dubai, and we were able to have youths sign up to the gym, but they were only allowed to do so if the parents bought them personal training. So that's how I got into training youths in the first instance. And a lot of the things that you might think you can do with a youth, it'll all depend on the youth themselves. So as a blanket approach, when you're doing your workbook, we just say that a 14 to 16-year-old isn't going to be too fully developed. They're going to be quite young. But in real life situations, these 14 to 16-year-olds can be almost fully developed as adults. So we want to treat them as such a lot of the time, but maybe not go on to things like using barbells, not quite yet. We might use smaller dumbbells. We might use bands, as I said before, dowel pulls, a lot of body weight exercises. Again, we want them to actually be able to utilize their body. So training them in doing things like how to hip hinge, how to do a squat properly. Hip hinges, again, that relates to so many different exercises, but specifically deadlifts will be a really good thing for them if they can understand that at an early age. Get them to be able to explode, so get them to do some kind of sprint work, or even jumping, so we're still using those legs. There's so much we can still do with a person or a youth to still train them that you might not say on your workbook. So can I give a youth some light dumbbells? Yes. Would I put that in the workbook? Probably not. I could maybe get them to do some martial arts training at a young age as well. But again, that's going to have impact in it. So again, I might not put that into the workbook. Swimming is a good example for activities that youths can do. But again, you could use that in the manual, but it's not necessarily something I would put in there because it doesn't always demonstrate what we need. So youths can be a bit of a challenge sometimes as well because they get bored. They get bored really easy. So I wouldn't have a typical program for a youth. And again, parents will come in and tell you what they think their son or daughter should be doing in the gym or what their goals are, but still have the conversation with the youth themselves, find out what they really want to get out of the gym, and then help them understand that the things that they're doing help them get to that goal, so we can keep it less boring for them. And then again, use your imagination. That's a great thing about being a personal trainer is you actually get to use your imagination now and again and create some fun stuff. And I was able to do that a lot in the gym I was at, and that's why I trained most of the youths who came in the door. So that's a kind of overview of youths. But again, if you get any questions at the end, I'll cover that. Older populations, again, that could be somebody who's really frail, quite advanced in age, right down to somebody who's maybe in their 40s and they've got medical conditions. Again, we always want to kind of understand what they want out of any training with us, or what advice we can give them, even if it's just snippets of advice if they're asking on the gym floor, to help them, because it can be quite daunting to be in the gym. And I know some of the best experiences I've had training people have been overcoming specific injuries due to their age. One that kind of jumps to mind is I used to train a guy who was in his 60s, and he was a former baseball player. He played in the United States, and I got to train him. And again, it was in Dubai. And he had part of his rotator cuff taken out because of pitching. So again, I had to overcome that problem. He couldn't hold a barbell to do squats. He couldn't do certain exercises because of his shoulder. He couldn't get mobility there. It was affecting his life. He couldn't hold his kids. He couldn't do certain things. So after understanding what he wanted out of training and then getting him to see how he can adapt things, for instance, with the squat, he always thought he had to have his hands at shoulder width. And we had one hand at shoulder width, one hand really, really a way out there to allow him to still squat, and it didn't throw his balance off. He was able to do it again. He was over the moon. We worked on how to get the movement back in the shoulder, even though he was missing rotator cuff tissue. And again, he was able to have a better quality of life. And I think when you're dealing with the older population, it is the quality of life that we're usually thinking about. What better quality of life can we give a person through activity? And it could be nutrition, it could be activity, it could be just general advice that we have that they've never thought of because they don't think in the terms of a personal trainer. So again, listen to the person, get what you need from them in terms of information, and then offer the best solution to give them a better quality of life. That's the best thing I can say about trying to problem solve with people who have ailments, because a medical condition doesn't mean that they most of the time can't do exercise. It's usually in their head that they've blocked it off and said they can't do that. And then looking at pre and postnatal women. So when we look at prenatal, we're looking at the different trimesters. Now, I've trained quite a few pregnant women through the entire process of pregnancy and into the after pregnancy as well, the postnatal care. And the biggest thing for me is if you have a prior relationship to them getting pregnant, that is the best way to be able to understand your client and what they'll need from you through the process. So I've had people who have came to me, said they've got pregnant and they want to start training. And for me, that's a big red flag because I don't understand what they've been doing beforehand. So I need to observe. I ask them to come in, train just as normally. I observe them. I see what they're capable of doing, and then I can come up with a plan. But if I've already been coaching a person and then they get pregnant, that's great, because in trimester 1, I probably won't change anything. The loads can stay pretty much the same. Everything's pretty much the same unless anything pops up. So maybe they feel faint one day and I can adapt a training session, or they do a certain movement and it makes them feel a bit faint, or just whatever comes up, you know. And it will be that things will just come up. They might feel sicky if they put their hands over their head. Again, blood pressure issue. So again, it'll come up, but you can deal with it as it comes. But specific programming for that, we can keep it pretty much the same. Going into trimester 2, again, it's going to be very dependent on the client you had, or if it's a new client. If it's a new client, I would start to reduce anything that's overhead. I'd probably not have anything that goes overhead, no shoulder pressing or anything like that. I would also start to reduce the intensity, maybe by about 20-30%, so they're not working as hard. And then when you move into trimester 3, we're probably about 50% of the load that we would have normally. But in certain cases, and this was definitely one of my cases, the female was able to do deadlifting the entire way. They were doing HIIT training and they were 3 days overdue. Now, that was because we understood what that person wanted from the pregnancy. They'd been training with me prior to the pregnancy, so they were fit, they were able, they were capable. But always analyse the person that's in front of you, so that you can get the best result for them. And the kind of last bit after that is the aftercare. And when you go into postnatal, it's always good to make sure that you're looking after the client's mental welfare. And again, I would be doing that for any client anyway, but especially because of postpartum depression. You've also got things like the pelvic floor muscles might not be fully repaired yet. So again, jumping movements, getting them to go down onto the floor and stand up again, that might make them dizzy. So there's a whole load of things that we would look at and just be like, that's maybe not for now. And that can be up to a year after they've actually given birth. So you've got a kind of 6-month period afterwards where you really keep a close eye on their training. And then after that, you've got the next 6 months where they might still have issues. And then after a year, they should be back to the kind of way they were before. But again, woman to woman, this changes. So just keep your eye on that if you are ever going to train a female. And again, I've got a qualification in pre and postnatal coaching. So if you want to ask any specific questions, then please contact me rather than trying to just deal with it yourself. Okay, guys, so that kind of brings me to the end of the webinar for this evening. So I'm going to stop the recording here, and then I'll give you guys a chance to ask questions.